And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thank you so much for joining us once again. And it's great to have a individual who is well known in the UK political scene, and that is Ben Habib. Ben, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Peter. Good to see you. Thank you for having me on.
Great to see you. And I thoroughly enjoyed your event last week with you and Kate Hoey discussing many things Northern Irish, and we'll maybe touch on some of that. But people can obviously find you at Ben Habib6 on X on Twitter. Does that mean there are five other Ben Habibs before you?
Well, could be. I mean, I set that account up. I actually set it up, I think, could be as long ago as 2014. And then I ignored it. And then someone told me when I joined the Brexit Party, I did a little speech in April 2019, my maiden speech, having really not been aware of Twitter, although I joined it. And then I went out for a meal with a friend of mine a week after I made my maiden speech in April 2019. And he said, you've got a couple of thousand followers on Twitter. And I said, you're kidding me. And he said, no, you have. And so anyway, I've never looked back since then. Yeah,
It's grown and grown, and
it's grown and grown. Yeah.
not only your engagement as an MEP, but with reform and your common sense ideas on British society and where we are going. All fascinating. Your views and thoughts and your many media slots available on that. But Ben, if I can take you back before your days of politics, and I'll find out what on earth entered your head to think that you should engage in the area of politics. But back before then, you're Pakistani born, you're a businessman. Maybe you can touch a little bit about your background before we get onto the area of politics.
Sure. So I'm of mixed heritage, if that doesn't contravene any of the political correctness required nowadays. My dad is Pakistan Indian, born in India, 1933 in Punjab. My mother was born in Isleworth near Heathrow Airport in 1934.
It's a
She's
beautiful mix.
blonde. What? It's quite a mix. She's blonde, blue-eyed. Her father fought in the Somme, thankfully wasn't an officer, so survived the experience. Uh, Went to university after World War One and so on. Was in the Home Guard in World War Two, and fainted when my father invited my mother to marry him. When my mother informed her father, he fainted because the notion of her marrying a Pakistani and going across, it was a 2-month trip by ship in those days. 1961, they got married. And anyway, so mum went out to Pakistan. Dad was working for a pharmaceutical company. He got a PhD in heterocyclic organic chemistry in London. He went to work for Burroughs Wellcome, which then became Wellcome and then was bought by Glaxo eventually. He was heading up their Pakistani side. Mum joined him there. She was a fully qualified architect. She worked in Pakistan, which is a remarkable thing for a blonde, blue-eyed lady, back in the 60s. And I was born in 1965, went to the Karachi Grammar School from the age of 3 until I left in 1979, which was a school set up by the Scottish regiment that controlled Karachi. And Karachi Grammar School was a fantastic school. It had all the trappings of post-imperial India, and it had a curriculum which was basically an English curriculum. And I think we did the Oxford and Cambridge examination board. So it was a first-class education that I got in Pakistan. And it was a very happy 13 years that I had in Karachi as a child. But then Bhutto was deposed by Zia-ul Haq, which some people listening to this might recall. He was put on trial and hanged 2 years later. And between 1977, when he was deposed, and 1979, when he was hanged, schools were perpetually closed. And so my parents thought, right, we've got to get our 3 children out of the country to boarding school in England where they can get a continued good education. And I was sent to rugby school, which was a great privilege and I think a transformational experience for me. It was a bit like Colditz, but it kicked me into shape. And if I had the opportunity to live my life again, I would go through it every time, all over again. It was a fantastic formative experience. My brother went to prep school. My sister went to sixth form because we're all slightly different ages. And then I went to Cambridge after I left rugby, and I did organic chemistry like my father. And I was thinking of doing a PhD. I did natural sciences, specializing in organic chemistry. I was thinking of doing a PhD, which was I can remember it offered me an £8,000 per annum salary versus £17,500 working for Shearson Lehman Brothers, the investment bank in the city. And so I thought, well, that's a pretty clear choice. So I didn't really think much. Went into the city and became finance director then of a public reinsurance broker. Set up my own property thing in 1994, and I've been running that effectively since 1994. I floated in the year 2000. And I was a very happy businessman doing my own thing, having had a very privileged and lucky life, the good education that I've described. And I suppose even though my education and my background sounds quite institutional, and I was institutional, I was even head boy at rugby. There's always been a bit of a maverick in me, and I've run a small business, and when you run a small business, you get used to fighting Goliath because you have to deal with big banks, big pension funds, big insurance companies, and you're just a small business. And so you get used to having to take people on. And the maverick in me was kind of anti the controlling nature of the European Union. I was a Thatcherite child too. I grew up 1979. I was 13, and my first major job was 1987, still under Thatcher. And so I was small state, low taxation, aspiration over dependency, wealth creation over wealth redistribution. That was imbued in me. And the EU is obviously the antithesis of that. So I voted to leave the European Union in 2016. And it was then really that I began to realize something was wrong with our political fabric, because people who shouldn't have been involved in the debate about Brexit, like Mark Carney, who's meant to be the neutral governor of the Bank of England, was telling us that there'd be a run on the banks if we just simply voted to leave. And my antenna went up, and I thought, why the hell is he saying that? And I realized he was politicized, that our system wasn't neutral. It wasn't operating the way the United Kingdom should operate. And so I wrote furious letters to the Financial Times, not realizing the FT was completely opposed to my agenda. But they did publish my letters, which was nice. I wrote a couple in the Telegraph. And then Theresa May got elected, or appointed rather, as Prime Minister. And she made some great speeches. You'll remember those speeches where she said, no deal's better than a bad deal. Nothing's agreed till everything's agreed. It's just about managing. We've got to bring the whole country up. Wonderful speeches. And I thought, great. I can retire back to my business. I had a little dalliance and I went straight back to running my business. And then someone said, you should become a Tory donor. And I thought, oh, well, I don't really want to part with money to anyone, particularly the Tory party. They said, no, you should do it. You should do it. And I joined something called the Renaissance Group. And the Renaissance Group afforded you the ability to have lunch with a cabinet minister once a month. Quite cool, right? A cabinet minister once a month. 10 of you, no more than 10 of you was the promise. And you could ask him questions at the end of lunch. And my first lunch was with Michael Gove in June 2018, just about when the Chequers deal was coming out. Do you remember?
Yeah.
And I went to that lunch, again, pretty uninitiated in politics, thinking Michael Gove, the guy who campaigned for Brexit. This is one of my guys, our guy, So I was really excited to meet him. And I asked him at the end of lunch, being a businessman, there's been a lot of criticism of the Chequers deal. If we don't get a good deal, are you guys ready to leave without a deal? Theresa May has talked about leaving without a deal. Have you got a plan? Are we going to deregulate in case we end up in a trade war? Are we going to deregulate? Are we going to ditch regulations, cut taxes, supercharge the British economy, put a protected blanket around businesses that are caught in that buying and selling loop with the European Union? How are we going to manage all of this? And he said, we don't need to worry about that, Ben. None of that needs to be our concern because we're going to get a good deal with the European Union. And again, balloons went up in my head and I was thinking, oh my God, is that what this guy thinks? And from summer 2018, I mean, you everyone listening, and the story, 2018 through to 2019, all she did was prevaricate failed to deliver. And then I was very upset with everything that was going on, or throwing stuff at the television and mouthing off at every opportunity because I was so angry with her inability to do what was right for the country. And someone said, someone met me and they knew Nigel Farage, and they said, "Do you want to meet Nigel Farage? He's setting up something called the Brexit Party." And I thought, "Oh, do I really want to meet a racist, xenophobic, um, swivel-eyed lunatic?" Because that's how he was presented, right? That's how the mainstream presented Nigel. And I sort of and ahhed, so okay, well, I'll go and meet him. And of course, he was none of that. He's not a racist. He's not xenophobic, etc., etc. And one thing led to another, and he said, "Do you want to stand for the Brexit Party as an MEP?" And I said, "Yeah, what the hell? Why not? In for a penny, in for a pound." And that was the beginning of, well, I don't know where the beginning was, but that was certainly a big step in my journey of discovery, which has been never ending since then. And every time I think I've got a grip of how malign and hopeless our political class are, I see more of what our political class is up to. And I get more triggered and more engaged and more desirous to stay on the battlefield and deliver the result that the country needs. And yeah, so that's the answer. That was a very long answer to your very simple question, Peter.
Well, I want to jump in the politics side, but actually, your mom born in Isleworth, your father born in India, growing up in Pakistan at a school set up by a Scottish regiment, and then going to Cambridge. How does that affect your identity as an individual?
Well, we always spoke English at home. Dad is what I would call a lapsed Muslim at best. As children, he used to say to us, he used to love spare ribs in Chinese restaurants. And he used to say, "Don't you dare tell me this is pork because I won't be able to eat it." So we said, "Fine, Dad." But, we all celebrated Easter. We celebrated Christmas, and it was a big thing. So I was brought up, I mean, I wouldn't say I was brought up as a practicing Christian, but there was a Christian cultural background to my upbringing from a very early age. And of course, Pakistan then was still very much in the tailwinds of the imperial legacy. I mean, I can tell you it was a really wonderful childhood I had, Peter. It couldn't have been nicer. My peer group were all desirous and aspirational, desirous to come to the UK, aspirational about British values, what the United Kingdom stood for. There was no animosity with my peer group at school, at least. And I think the wider Pakistani population as well, towards the United Kingdom because of its imperial, control of the subcontinent. None. We had the privilege of having staff as children, and my father's cook rather, served under Winston Churchill. He was the water boy in the late 19th century, and he died at a grand old age. But I overlapped with him, and he'd outlived 5 wives. He'd been shot a number of times in various campaigns because we fought alongside the British Army. So there was a very strong British heritage coming through. And my cook, sorry, just finish on my cook. His name was Yasin. He died a long, long time ago. But he used to say there's only really ever been one true monarch, and that is Queen Victoria. He used to say that to me as a child. So that's how strong the British legacy was in Pakistan. And what we've sadly seen with Pakistan and a lot of countries in the Middle East is that over the last 40, 50 years, they've progressively moved away from that close connection that they had with the United Kingdom through the Commonwealth. And, we can talk about Islam and the way Islam has evolved, but even Islam then was a much more enlightened, lighter touch form of Islam than the Wahhabi purist fundamentalism that we now see so often on our own streets. And my peer group, with whom I'm still, very much in touch in Pakistan, they're still of the ilk that they were when we were children, and they don't like it. They don't like a lot of what they see going on in the direction of They don't like Wahhabism and so on. And yeah, so I was brought up. Even though I was born in Pakistan, I had a blanket around me of sort of Christian cultural and British historical context. And of course, then coming to rugby, that was all very reinforced. Our staple diet was Commando mags. Do you remember Commando mags? Did you ever read Commando mags, Peter?
Commander
You know
Max.
what I mean by Commando mags?
Oh
And
yes,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
if you need a connection with, what is good about the United Kingdom's history, just read a Commando mag because we were the good guys, right? We always beat the awful Germans. And when you're brought up on a diet of Commando mags and history taught to you through a proud prism. I did the historical period that I did at rugby was late 18th century through to late 19th century. So we did, Pitt the Elder, Pitt the Younger, Napoleonic Wars, Peel, and all of that. And it was taught us in a very positive light because it was a fantastic period for the United Kingdom. And so I grew up very proud of this country. And when I re-engaged with the political, when I engaged, not re-engaged, when I engaged with politics for the first time, I was struck by how ashamed people had become of this country. And it didn't compute with me. I'd been traveling in this cocoon, believing that everyone still was of my kind of disposition, but they're not. And yeah, so that's it in a nutshell. Even though I was born in Pakistan, really, I have. I mean, this is my country. I've always felt this is my country, and I love this country.
Well, I want to get and touch on Islam, but I want to touch on the political side first. Your time as a MEP for 6 months, basically at the end of the Brexit deal, and I remember well because I was in UKIP, so I remember well the Brexit Party appearing and then running in those elections. What but and then into reform and all of that. Do you want to give us that journey? Because there, I think people have reform are doing very well in the polls, 27%, we're told, but there's also frustration maybe at the leadership, and you certainly had highlighted the issue of the lack of democracy in the party, run more like, I guess, more like Gert Wilders maybe in the Netherlands, where he's the sole member. I know Reform have got a few more, but not really many. Um, Tell us a little bit about that, kind of the move from Brexit to Reform and your maybe concerns at the way it was going.
So that has also been a revelation for me. That journey itself has been a revelation. First, I woke up to the malign and incompetent nature of the British governing class. And then I woke up to my own concerns about my own camp. And the first warning sign came when Nigel stood down 317 candidates against the Conservatives in the 2019 general election. Until then, I was certain that we were ideologues. All of us in the Brexit party would stand our ground, come hell or high water, and we would die fighting for the Brexit that this country deserved and voted for the entire United Kingdom to leave the EU as one country. That was what I wanted. And we all knew, everyone knew, and there'll be loads of clips of Nigel, me, and others back in 2019 saying Boris Johnson withdrawal agreement is rubbish because of what it does to Northern Ireland and all the promises it makes about alignment on state aid, competition, employment, environmental law, contribution to military, cooperation, etc. So we all denounced, but then we stood down and gave Boris Johnson power. And the argument that was made at the time, which I accepted, was that Jeremy Corbyn was the risk. And if we didn't back Boris Johnson, you'd get a Jeremy Corbyn government. And with Jeremy Corbyn, you would then get a second referendum, and that would be the end of Brexit. And I also did say on a Sophie Ridge program in November 2019 that I thought the withdrawal agreement was worse than remaining. I would have rather have remained and then fought for a proper Brexit than to get the bastardization form of Brexit that we got. Anyway, the argument that Nigel made that you second Jeremy Corbyn, you get a Jeremy Corbyn second referendum, that prevailed, and I accepted it, and that was fine. But in my own mind at the time, and I wrote an article on it saying that you can look it up if you wish. It was in January 2020. I wrote this article saying I'll support the withdrawal agreement, but I'll be watching Boris Johnson to make sure he honours the promises he's made on Brexit. Take back control of our laws, our borders, our cash. The country would leave the EU as one United Kingdom. These fundamental promises he made, and I will be judging them. And if he doesn't rewrite the withdrawal agreement, because do you remember there was a subsequent trade agreement that was being negotiated at the time that the withdrawal agreement was being put in place? It was that we left in two phases. First, the withdrawal agreement, and then there was a trade agreement that came at the end of 2020. And Boris said he would put a lot of the things right in the trade agreement. And then the second alarm for me was that the Brexit Party disbanded in January 2020. And I couldn't understand why it disbanded, because the job wasn't done. We all knew the job wasn't done. We should have been all staying together and taking the fight to Boris and saying, no, buddy, you deliver your promises. But we disbanded. And then Nigel, understandably, having devoted 20 years of his life, went off to make a bit of money. But I was convinced, as I still am today, that those of us who fought for Brexit have a duty to continue to fight, because we sold it to the British people. We said this was going to be a great success. And of course, the withdrawal agreement is not Brexit. It's a bastardization of something. And so I think those of us who campaigned for it, sold it to the British people, need to stand their ground, and they shouldn't leave the battlefield till it's done. And so that was my position. And I totally accept Nigel wanted to go off and do his own thing. But then I saw a few other things that Nigel did that worried me. So, for example, he wasn't wholly behind me. Indeed, he didn't even hardly mention the fight that I was having over Northern Ireland, which for me is fundamental to Brexit. And the reason it's fundamental to me is because Great Britain can't leave the EU while Northern Ireland Protocol is in place and while there's an Irish Sea border, because it acts as a grappling hook into the flesh of Great Britain. And so even if you're a Little Englander, or you only see the mainland as that unit that you wish to protect, you can't get Brexit even for that unit if you don't get rid of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Quite apart from the fact that, of course, what kind of country are we? What kind of governing class are we if we just chuck part of the United Kingdom under a bus for expediency? And but I was surprised Nigel didn't have me on GB News every night talking about the protocol. I was surprised he didn't support my litigation and bang the drum on it and say we need to get rid of the RC border. And even now, I don't want to have a crack at Nigel. Well, I am having a crack at Nigel, but he talks more about the Chagos Islands than he does about Northern Ireland. And I could see a kind of ideological chasm opening up between Nigel and me. And then Nigel was on the record saying a united Ireland is inevitable, and that Mary Lou MacDonald isn't such a bad person, and he quite enjoys the company of Leo Varadkar. Well, these people are the devil to me, and a united Ireland is something I would never, ever concede as a possibility, and nor should it ever come to transpire. Absolutely not. And I could just see little things like that. And so by the time Richard said, "Will you join Reform UK?" I said I was nervous of the ideological differences between myself and Nigel. And of course, Nigel owns the party, so it's a crucial thing to bear in mind. And I said to Richard, I'll only join if Nigel gives up his shareholding. And he can give it up in any number of different ways, but I only want to join if it's democratized. And Nigel refused to do it. And then after a lot of negotiations and pushing and shoving, Richard agreed to write a letter to me in which he basically made 4 promises that we would continue to fight for Brexit, that Brexit wasn't done. And that was another dividing point between me and Nigel. Nigel says Brexit's done, but we haven't taken advantage of it. And I say Brexit's not done. Brexit is not done. And there are lots of different, I can go into detail on why it's important to distinguish between those two positions. And it's vital, frankly, to distinguish between them, because if you accept Brexit's done, but it just hasn't been done properly, you then have to defend this crap that we've got. And you have to accept that Northern Ireland is under the jackboot of Brussels. And I don't accept that Brexit can be anything other than a success. And I don't accept that Northern Ireland should be anywhere near the jackboot of Brussels. So that was another thing. And anyway, so Richard made a promise that we would fight for Brexit. He acknowledged in his letter that Brexit wasn't done, that we would fight for Brexit and for Northern Ireland, that there would be no deals done with the Tories in any forthcoming general election, and that the party would be run in a consensual manner. And believing, as I did at the time, that Nigel wanted to go off and make money on Beyond GB News and all the rest of it, and I had this letter from Richard, I thought, fine, I'll join Reform. And we had a really good partnership, Richard and me. We took it from 6% in the polls to 16% when the general election was called. We were going to win seats, whether Nigel came back or not. But then Nigel appointed himself as leader without picking the phone up to me as deputy leader, without forewarning me. Forget about a discussion. I wasn't even warned. I learned about it at the same time as everyone else did. And that was another massive balloon going up in my head, because it reminded me about the crucial nature of the democratization of the party. You can't have a change of leadership without a discussion with the deputy leader, in my view. And so the minute Nigel came back, I was saying to Richard and to Nigel, you've got to democratize the party. This can't go on. I'll bite my lower lip during the general election, but after the general election, you've got to democratize. And I started, as we went through the general election, I began to increase the noise behind democratizing, increase my campaign. And then Nigel declared straight after the general election that there would be branches, they would be democratized, that the headquarters itself would be democratized. He said he'd give up his shareholding to members. There'd be a new constitution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And none of that has come about the way it was promised. The new constitution doesn't democratize the party. It leaves control firmly, in my view, in the leadership's hands. And Nigel hasn't given up his shareholding in the party. And anyone looking at the party now has to concede that it is still just Nigel Farage. All you see is Nigel Farage. You don't see the creation. Sure, there are 4 other MPs, but it's the Nigel Farage show. And you're not seeing the development of what I would regard as, a broad and deep intellectual leadership, which is capable of forming a government. Nor are you seeing the development of a genuinely democratic branch network with grassroots campaigners, membership from across the country, campaigning, etc. And he goes on a lot about the number of members he's got, but they're not members, they're subscribers. And there's no ability to test whether they're genuine human beings even. Unlike the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, when you join them as a member, you have to prove it or some historical figure. But I can tell you with certainty that if you were to go onto Reform's website now, Peter, and register as Peter Rabbit, you would be allowed to register, and you would come and you'd get a membership number, and it wouldn't realize. So that the fundamental flaws in what's going on underneath the water. Above the water, Nigel is doing great things. He's running circles around the Conservative Party. The air war is absolutely reforms, but it concerns me deeply that actually fundamentally the constitution of the party isn't right, that it's not developing a broad and deep intellectual base capable of running the country, and that it hasn't got a grassroots. And also, Peter, while I'm at it, Nigel is going weak at the knees on the crucial things that he used to stand for. So he is on the record saying he's not worried about the rate of demographic change. He's on the record saying he's not in favor of mass deportation of illegal migrants. He's on the record, as I've said, about, saying he's in favor of a united Ireland, and so on and so forth. And Nigel seems to me, and I have to talk about Nigel, because when you talk about reform, it is just Nigel, right? So forgive me, Nigel, if this sounds like this is all ad hominem. It's not, because you are the personification of the party. You own it. You're the face of it. You're the policy maker. You are reform. Reform and Nigel are synonymous. Nigel isn't, I don't think, brave enough to move the Overton window, which is critical, in my view, if we're to save the country. We've got to the point in this country now where it is literally unacceptable in polite political circles to be patriotic, to win, to be proud of the Union flag, to bang the drum for the United Kingdom, to be proud of our imperial past. All of these things are verboten. And Nigel, I don't think, has the courage to move the Overton window in the direction it needs to go to sanitize all of that. And I think part of the reason he says he's not worried about rate of demographic change, etc., is because he's currying favor with the mainstream. But that's not what we want. It's not what I want. I don't think it's what the British people want. What the British people want is what they voted for in 2016, a proud, independent, sovereign United Kingdom with policies made for our betterment and for the people's betterment. And that's it. And so Nigel will probably be, if he's watching this, I don't know, he would have switched off years ago after hearing what I've been saying. But, he would probably disagree with what I'm saying. But the evidence is Steve Edgington interview with him, watch the Winston Marshall interview with him, and listen to the way he's slowly pivoting to the center ground. He didn't come out in my view, and challenge the Prime Minister and Yvette Cooper even remotely over what happened after the protests in Southport, the way that Keir Starmer politicized the criminal justice system and incarcerated 70 people, one of whom was Peter Lynch, who has now hanged himself. Nigel doesn't recognize, for example, that it was the Attorney General, Lord Hermer, who's a deeply flawed individual in my view, highly politicized, defended Gerry Adams, wishes to change the Legacy Act so that Gerry Adams can bring a case against the British government. He promoted the interest of illegal migrants getting to the United Kingdom. That's Lord Hermer. Nigel won't recognize that Lord Hermer's intervention in Tommy Robinson's civil case, turning it into a criminal case, actually does make Tommy Robinson a political prisoner. That's got nothing to do with Tommy Robinson. You don't have to love Tommy Robinson to recognize that. But if you recognize we've got a two-tier criminal justice system and you're open to what's going on, then you should call that out. And Nigel doesn't call it out. He doesn't call out the death of Peter Lynch in prison after having been, in my view, wrongfully incarcerated for 2 years and 8 months. 61-year-old man should never have been in prison, hanged himself. I haven't heard Nigel once speak about Peter Lynch. So Nigel needs to get with the program. That's not what the British people want. And I think that's largely why Musk called Nigel out, because he can see the Americans are very brave. They do shift the Overton window. Trump is continually shifting that Overton window. When he threatened Colombia with sanctions and a whole load of other things if they didn't take their illegal migrants back, he shifted the Overton window. When he was on the verge of imposing tariffs on Mexico and Canada, he shifted the Overton window. 2 days ago, when he said he's going to send illegal migrants and even US citizens to El Salvador for punishment, he shifted the Overton window. Are you with me? And, our politicians aren't prepared to do it. But the one person who should be doing it is Nigel. Nigel should be doing this. He should be banging that drum. And we're not going to win the election. We're not going to win the country by going down the middle of the mainstream, which is what got us into these problems in the first place. We've got to wake up and realize that the Overton window needs to shift. And it was because of that I realized I've got to do something to make that Overton window shift. And that's how the Great British Political Action Committee came about. It takes its lead. So this is the thing that I'm chairing
Well,
now. It takes its
because
lead from the
because I
US.
wanted, because you're right, the frustration um of what Nigel is doing, just being a campaign group as opposed to a political party, that grassroots branch level, that's not there. And I know you've walked away, as of a number of others. Howard Cox was there on Saturday at Tommy's event speaking. At this Great British PAC, it seems an interesting part of the conversation, because I don't think we're going to have election for another 4 years. Labour have got too big a majority. Despite
Yeah.
anything else that may happen, I think that is more or less fixed, and there's no threat, irrelevant of who's leading the Labour Party. They've got that majority. And the Great British PAC is a interesting different part of a conversation to where we go in the midst of actually politically nothing's going to happen for 4 years. So fill us in on the Great British PAC. I've looked through the website, I've heard you speaking about it, and to me it's very exciting what you're doing as chairman of that.
Well, thank you. So the fight between those who want to champion, save our country, and protect, promote, and celebrate our country, the fight between us and the Labour Party, as you rightly say, Peter, isn't until 2029. There's probably not much we can do until then. I mean, an election may come early, but it's unlikely. The fight right now is for the heart and minds of our side of the debate. The fight right now is trying to make sure that the so-called right wing, and there's no right wing anymore in politics, in my view. What they call right wing are people who are proud of the United Kingdom and care about the country and our sovereignty, etc. The fight is amongst ourselves for the hearts and minds of that movement, and to make sure, in my mind, that that movement isn't infected with the wet nonsense with which it's been infected for so long, that has prohibited it from being able to succeed, including, in my view, Nigel is infected, Reform is infected. And so we're not a think tank. We are going to raise money, and we're going to bring pressure on all so-called centre-right, right-wing parties to make sure that they are doing the right thing. So the first thing we're going to do, Peter, is to try and shift that Overton window to a position where it allows people like Nigel, Kemi Badenoch, Robert Jenrick, Suella Braverman to say what they want to say without being castigated. We've got to make it normal to talk about saving our country. We've got to make it normal about putting British interests first, normal to put British citizens' interests first. We've got to normalize that before we can really win for the country. That's the first thing. The second thing is to have the policies with which to do it. There's no point just shifting the Overton window in great campaigning razzmatazz, but then have nothing to follow up behind it. So we're going to create the policies. And there's no point having policies unless you've got the people to deliver it. And the other thing that I notice in Parliament is how low the caliber of the individual parliamentarian is, with some notable exceptions, but on average. And so we're going to find people, not just to be parliamentarians, but we reckon we need about 2,000 people who can be parliamentarians, be in public services, civil service, etc., who are of our disposition and are capable of delivering our disposition into government. So move the center of gravity of discourse, get the people so they can do it. And then the last leg, if you like, is to actually draft the legislation that's required in order to do it. So that when we get into office, and it doesn't matter to me whether it's a coalition of Reform and the Tories, or whether it's Reform, or whether it's the Tories, as long as they do the right thing, it's not party political what I'm doing. It's pressuring the right to do it. Anyway, so we're going to produce draft legislation. So when whoever it is gets into power to save our country, they will have, if they want it, all our draft legislation. And we will act like an open code company. We will not be holding anything to our chests. Our people will be available to reform. Our policies, our people will be available to reform on the Tories. Our policies will be available to both, and our draft legislation will be available to both, and indeed smaller parties if they want them. So we're gonna do the heavy lifting, backed by proper money and real commitment. It's a proper business we're setting up to save the country. That's what we're doing, and we'll be there to help and pressure the centre right parties to make sure that they do the right thing.
Tell how people can get involved. They can go to greatbritishpac.com. All the links will be in the description. And the X link is on your X account, Ben. But people can go, they can suggest ideas, they can join, they can donate. Let the viewers and listeners know how they can play a part in this.
Yeah, so we're looking for regional organizers. So if you're interested in being a regional organizer, please do go on the website and say so. You please register on the website so you can get our newsletters and be kept in touch with what we're doing. Separately, we have a policy platform on the website, and sign up for that. That allows you the ability to put forward your policy ideas, which our regional coordinators and HQ will then pass. We will use it as empirical evidence for where the people want policy to go. And we will use it as a genuinely ground up mechanism by which policies can be made that the people want. We want to have contact with the people. And I think one of the problems, digressing very momentarily, one of the problems with the Conservative Party is that it doesn't have much of a membership anymore. It used to have 2.8 million members. It's now got 130,000. So it's lost its contact with the people. And Reform doesn't have contact with the people because actually it's a top-down, owned by Nigel, without a grassroots kind of party. So we will have that connection. We will have that connection with the people. And so the policy platform, register as a subscriber. I would say member, but that's a prejudicial term nowadays. A subscriber. And of course, donate. Please donate. We'll be looking to bigger donors to get the machine going, but every penny counts. And, as I hope people can see that I've been on this fight ever since I got in. I haven't left the battlefield for a moment since the 12th of April, 2019. And the Great British PAC will not leave the battlefield. I will not leave the Great British PAC. And we will keep swinging that bat for country rather than party, making sure the parties do the right thing to make sure we then, when it comes to 2029, we eject Labour and we hit the ground running and we save our country.
Well, it's certainly something that I'm excited in. I felt on the sidelines post UKIP, and Reform has never connected with me at a heart level. And that's why I think you, in terms of business background, in terms of actually being born in a Muslim country and growing up, I think that brings understanding, not just growing up in the UK, but this endeavour, the Great British PAC, is something I think we all need to keep an eye on and support, and encourage all our viewers and listeners to play your part, sign up, watch this closely, because I don't think that Reform are going to be the saviours for us. Whether or not the Great British PAC or Ben is a savior, I don't know, but I think it's important to look at other options. So, Ben, thank you so much for joining us. There's so much more we could cover, but I think it's important to end on that endeavour, the Great British PAC, because it is something that is positive going forward. And I think often the political discourse is negative certainly in terms of what's happening in the UK. Maybe US, Europe, it's positive, but in the UK, it's less so. That's why I think the Great British PAC is a positive contribution to where we are as a society. So thank you so much for joining us and filling us in on that.
Thank you, Peter, for having me on. As you might have noticed, I can talk, so you're right to bring it to an end.
We will continue on the second part, Ben, if your time allows. Very happy to do that. But thank you for giving us your time today.